Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, thank you. I'm very honoured to be here, especially as I hear it's the first time you've done a joint event like this. And WGM, World Development Movement, is a UK-based anti-poverty campaigning organisation. We're not a charity. We campaign to change the root causes of poverty in developing countries. Thank you, Martin, for a great introduction, and it's nice that you've not contradicted anything I was planning to say. That's always a good sign.
What's that one?
So yeah, I mean, the title of tonight's discussion was Will There Be a World Food Crisis? And as you say, precisely, for many people there already is a world food crisis, and the hunger we've seen over the last perhaps 50 years or so, as you say, has been a crisis of distribution. It's not that there's not been enough food, it's that the people who've needed it have not been able to access that food. And we've heard a bit already about the sort of upward trend in food prices being driven by some of these supply and demand factors. But what we've also seen in recent years, which is not so easily linked to those sort of factors that Martin mentioned, is the increased volatility in food prices. So the best known example of that is the 2007-2008 food crisis, where we saw an enormous spike in the prices of food, and then suddenly the prices dropped off. So that is much more difficult to explain by factors like a shift towards biofuel production, by changes in dietary patterns around the world. Now both these patterns, both the general upward trend and the volatility that we're seeing, are obviously really bad news for the poorest people in the world who, unlike us who spend probably 10% of our income perhaps on food, they're spending anything between 50 and 90% of their income on food. So if food prices are peaking in the way that they have done in the last few years, people are suddenly having to cut back on expenditure on things like healthcare and education. They're perhaps having to just buy the staple foods instead of being able to afford a healthier diet with perhaps a bit of fruit and veg in there or whatever. In some cases, women particularly are having to go into risky employment, so prostitution, mail order brides, that kind of thing. So there's some real knock-on impacts from the hikes in food prices. And I think when it comes to particularly the volatility that we've seen recently in food prices, really the only thing that can properly explain that is speculation that we're seeing. So just to sort of give you a bit of background to that, that the sort of food futures markets were set up in the 19th century to help, it was in the US, to help farmers to sort of hedge their risk so that they could sell a contract for say 6 months in the future to sell their expected harvest of wheat at a particular price. So if the prices went through the floor, at least they'd be guaranteed a price that covered their cost. Likewise, if you're perhaps a miller, you know that you're going to be able to buy the wheat you need at a particular price, even if prices go up in the meantime. So it was set up to serve the producers and the buyers of food. Now what happened was speculators soon figured out that they could make some money out of this and piled into the market. So in the 1930s under Roosevelt, they introduced regulation to curb the involvement of speculators. Now that regulation stayed in place until really recently, actually, around the 1990s, when some of the big banks, Goldman Sachs in particular, lobbied really hard to have this regulation watered down. And that's kind of left us in the regulatory position that we're in at the moment. And it's really stark that in the last decade or so, since that deregulation has happened, we've seen a huge increase in the involvement of the banks, non-food actors, people who aren't actually physically buying and selling food, are piling into these markets, and it really correlates with the increased volatility that we're seeing in these markets. And basically we're seeing speculative money sort of riding on the existing trends. This was really well illustrated just last summer. So last summer there was very low rainfall and drought in Russia, and wildfires which affected the wheat crops there. Now, as a result, we saw a really sharp increase in the price of wheat. But actually there wasn't a supply problem. It was the third highest global harvest of wheat on record. So the supply can't account for those food price rises, but it was speculators thinking, the price of food's going to go up. Let's put some money into these markets where we can make a quick buck. And that's really what accounts for that example of a real spike in food prices, which then dropped off again. So the sort of good news and bad news. The good news is that this regulation that previously existed could be brought back, and in fact in the US it has. So last summer they passed, the Obama administration signed the Dodd-Frank Act, which was a financial reform act, which includes provision to re-regulate the derivatives markets, including the commodities derivatives market, which is where this speculation is occurring. Even better news, the EU is hoping to do the same. So there's a real opportunity here to deal with speculation. As we heard, there's lots of factors which affect food prices, some of them very difficult to tackle. Climate change, we've all been trying on that one and it feels like we're not getting very far very fast. But speculation is really quite a simple one, relatively speaking, to tackle. There was regulation, it worked. When we got rid of it, it stopped. We got this problem. So it's relatively simple to bring this regulation back. And there are proposals being brought forward by the European Commission, which will be going through the European Parliament and being put to the Council of Ministers towards the end of this year. So our challenge in the UK is really to get the UK government to support these proposals, or at the very least not to block the regulation, which other countries in Europe are supportive of, particularly France, who have the presidency of the EU this year.
Thank you. Phil?
I should imagine it's quite a complex thing, but how is the speculation that you've been talking about, how does it affect the remaining virgin rainforest?
I'd say there's probably two kind of slants on it. One is that obviously if food prices are high and are set to remain high, then it's more profitable to clear new land for food production. So it is, I suppose, a driving force behind that. And it's interesting, there's been quite a lot of attention on soy and the impacts of soy and rainforest clearance, and perhaps it's not always the soy plantations that come in and clear virgin forests, but the effect is that the soy producers perhaps encroach onto land that was already cleared, pushing the people off that land who then have to clear new land for themselves. So although the companies involved may not physically be cutting down the trees, they may be a large factor in the deforestation that's happening. But I think the second route into that is, as you suggested, just that companies see that they can make money from actually owning the land, and that's a real driving force for deforestation, whether, as I say, it's them physically employing people to cut down trees, or whether it's effectively perhaps pushing up the price of land, so pushing people off the land that they previously had tenure for onto more marginal land, which they may clear. So even if they're not, the companies involved are not physically clearing the land themselves, they're effectively causing that to happen.
You or do other development charities believe that the terms of trade will ever be settled in a way that allows poor countries to grow out of their poverty through that route?
I mean, I think certainly the way in which the system is set up currently, if there was radical reform of the current trade rules, then developing countries would certainly stand a chance. And I think, I mentioned Ha-Joon Chang before, he's a Korean economist who's now based at Cambridge, and he draws on his own example of growing up in Korea, which was 50 years ago a very poor country and now competes in the world economy. He argues is that Korea maintained protections on its industries to allow them to develop to a stage when they could compete on the world market. They did that successfully, and now Korea is among some of the most developed countries in the world. So I think that's really where we would stand on trade.